A solitary Cheyenne warrior rescued a girl from the deadly rapids of Thunder Creek, unaware that saving her life would unleash a chain of events that would test everything he believed about honor, survival, and the price of choosing love over duty. In the unforgiving American frontier, the Wyoming Territory stretched endlessly beneath a merciless August sun in 1878, its golden grasslands rippling like an ocean of wheat under the constant prairie wind. Nakota moved through this vastness like a shadow given flesh, his paint horse's hooves making barely a whisper against the hard-packed earth. 3 days' ride from the nearest trading post, 2 weeks from the closest settlement, and a lifetime away from the Cheyenne village that had cast him out. He existed in a world where silence was both companion and enemy.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
His weathered buckskin shirt bore the intricate beadwork of his mother's hands, now 8 winters cold in the ground. His rifle, a Winchester repeater traded for prime beaver pelts, rested across his thighs with the easy familiarity of a man who had learned that survival often balanced on the edge of a trigger. But it was his eyes that told the true story, dark as storm clouds, holding depths that spoke of betrayal, exile, and a pain that had carved itself so deep into his soul that he no longer remembered what it felt like to trust. Nakota had been riding the high country for 3 moons now, following the deer trails and elk paths that wound through the Bighorn Mountains like veins through stone. The white settlers called this land empty, but he could read its language in every blade of grass, every shifted stone, every scent carried on the wind. Today, something was different. The usual chorus of meadowlarks had fallen silent. Even the ever-present buzz of grasshoppers seemed muted, as if the very earth was holding its breath. He reined in his horse at the crest of a ridge and studied the valley below. Thunder Creek cut through the landscape like a silver scar, its waters running higher and faster than usual for late summer. Recent rains in the high mountains had turned the normally placeable stream into a torrent of churning white water and hidden rocks. The sound of it reached him even at this distance, a low, continuous roar that spoke of power and danger in equal measure. That's when he saw the dust cloud dot miles to the east. A thin brown line rose against the blue sky, moving steadily westward along what the whites called the Bozeman Trail. A wagon train, most likely, though something about its size and speed seemed wrong. Nakota had watched dozens of settler convoys pass through this country, and they moved like injured buffalo, slow, cautious, stopping frequently to rest their animals and check their wheels. This dust cloud spoke of urgency, perhaps even panic. He touched his heels to his horse's flanks and began picking his way down the rocky slope toward the creek. Whatever was happening with that wagon train, it was none of his concern. The white world and its troubles had ceased to be his problem the day his own people had branded him traitor and cast him into the wilderness to die alone. Let the settlers deal with their own misfortunes. He had learned the hard way that involving himself in other people's fate only led to suffering. But as he reached the valley floor, the sound of gunshots echoed across the grassland like thunder. Nakota's horse danced nervously beneath him, ears pricked forward toward the distant sounds of conflict. Through his field glasses, another trade good that had cost him 2 prime wolf pelts, he could make out the details of what was unfolding near the creek crossing. A single wagon, heavily loaded and listing to one side on a broken wheel, sat stranded in the middle of the ford. Around it, mounted figures moved in the classic pattern of attack and retreat that spoke of bandits or renegades rather than organized military action. The smart thing would be to ride away, the safe thing, the thing that would keep him alive. To see another sunset in this harsh country where a man's survival depended on minding his own business and trusting no one. But even as these thoughts crossed his mind, Nakota found himself studying the tactical situation with the eye of a warrior. Trained from childhood in the arts of combat, 4 attackers, maybe 5, circling the wagon like wolves around a wounded elk. Their movements were coordinated, but not disciplined outlaws then, rather than cavalry deserters or renegade Indians. The defenders were putting up a fight, but their fire was sporadic and poorly aimed. Civilians caught in the open with nowhere to run and no real hope of escape. Another volley of shots rang out, followed by a scream that cut through the afternoon air like a knife through silk. High-pitched, desperate, unmistakably female. Nakota's jaw tightened as memories he had tried to bury came flooding back, memories of another time, another place, when he had been too far away to help when help was needed most. His hand moved to the leather medicine bag that hung around his neck, fingers touching the small piece of carved bone inside. His sister's gift, given to him on the day he had received his warrior's name. "Promise me," she had whispered with her dying breath, blood staining the snow red around her broken body. "Promise me you'll never let fear stop you from doing what's right." The gunfire intensified, and through the haze of distance and dust, Nakota saw one of the attackers wheel his horse toward the creek itself. The man was holding something or someone across his saddle bow. Even at this range, the splash of bright fabric was unmistakable. A woman's dress, pale blue like a summer sky, now muddy and torn. Without conscious thought, Nakota kicked his horse into a gallop. The paint responded instantly, powerful muscles bunching and releasing as they thundered across the valley floor. Nakota kept low in the saddle, using every fold and depression in the terrain to mask his approach. The wind whipped his long black hair behind him like a war banner, and for the first time in months, he felt something other than the cold emptiness that had become his constant companion. He felt alive. The bandit holding the woman had reached the edge of the creek and was forcing his horse into the churning water. The current immediately caught them, and the horse struggled to maintain its footing on the slippery rocks of the stream. The woman Nakota could see her clearly now, young and fighting like a wildcat despite her bonds was making the outlaw's task even more difficult with her desperate struggles. Nakota angled his approach to intercept them downstream, where the creek curved around a stand of cottonwoods. He would have one chance, maybe 2 heartbeats to act before the current either swept them all to their deaths or carried them beyond his reach. His Winchester came up smoothly, the familiar weight of it settling into his hands like an old friend returning home. The outlaw was halfway across the creek when Nakota burst from the tree line. The man's head snapped around, eyes wide with surprise and sudden fear. He tried to bring his own weapon to bear while maintaining his grip on the struggling woman, but the horse beneath him chose that moment to stumble on the treacherous footing, Nakota's. Shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him sideways in the saddle. His grip on the woman loosened, and she tumbled into the raging water with a splash that was lost in the creek's constant roar. The wounded outlaw cursed and tried to wheel his horse back toward shore, but the current had them now, sweeping horse and rider downstream toward the rapids that waited like hungry teeth in the rocks below. Without hesitation, Nakota urged his horse into the water. The creek was deeper than it looked, and far colder. The paint horse snorted and lunged as the current tried to sweep them sideways, but Nakota guided the animal with knees and voice, reading the water like he would read sign on a game trail. There a flash of pale blue fabric among the foam and spray. The woman was fighting to keep her head above water, but her heavy dress was dragging her down, and the swift current was carrying her inexorably toward the rapids. Nakota leaned far out from his saddle, stretching his arm toward the drowning woman. Their fingers touched, missed, touched again. She looked up at him with eyes the color of storm clouds, wide with terror but fierce with the will to live. He could see her lips moving, trying to form words that were lost in the thunder of the water, but he didn't need to hear them to understand. Help me. His hand closed around her wrist just as the current swept them both toward the rapids. The paint horse gave a desperate surge of power, hooves scrambling for purchase on the rocky bottom as Nakota hauled the woman up and across his saddle.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
She was dead weight for a moment, water streaming from her hair and clothes, and then she was clinging to him with surprising strength, her face pressed against his chest as he fought to guide his horse toward the far bank. They made it with barely a yard to spare before the rapids would have claimed them all. The paint horse lunged up the muddy bank and stood trembling, sides heaving from the effort. Nakota slid from the saddle and helped the woman down, his hands automatically checking her for injuries, even as his eyes scanned the creek behind them for signs of pursuit. The wounded outlaw was nowhere to be seen, probably swept downstream to his death in the rapids. From the direction of the wagon, the gunfire had ceased, which meant either the defenders had won or there was no one left to defend. Either way, Nakota and the woman were alone beside the rushing creek, two strangers, thrown together by chance and violence in a land that cared nothing for either of their lives. She was shivering despite the heat of the afternoon, shock and cold water combining to steal the warmth from her body. Her dress, expensive, he could see now, with fine lace and careful stitching, was ruined, torn and stained with creek water and mud. Her hair, once elaborately pinned and styled in the fashion of Eastern ladies, now hung in wet tangles around her shoulders. But it was her eyes that held his attention. Those storm-gray eyes that seemed to look right through him, past the buckskin and war paint and the reputation that had made even his own people fear him. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of the water. I thought I was going to die." Nakota said nothing. He was already regretting his impulse to help, already calculating the complications this woman's presence would bring to his carefully ordered solitude. She was obviously a settler, probably from one of the wagon trains heading for the gold fields in Montana Territory. Her people would be looking for her, and when they found her in the company of a lone Cheyenne warrior, questions would be asked that he had no desire to answer. But as he looked at her, really looked at her, something inside his chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the cold creek water. She was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. There was something in her face, in the set of her jaw, and the determined light in her eyes, that spoke of strength beyond her delicate appearance. This was not some pampered Eastern flower who would wilt at the first touch of frontier hardship. This was a woman who had just faced death in the rapids and come out fighting. "What's your name?" she asked, and there was genuine curiosity in her voice rather than the fear he usually heard when white people spoke to him. For a long moment, he considered not answering. Names had power, his grandmother had always said. Once you shared your name with someone, you gave them a piece of your spirit. But something about this moment, about the way the afternoon light caught the water drops in her hair and made them sparkle like scattered diamonds, made him abandon caution. "Nakota," he said simply. She smiled then, the first real smile he had seen in longer than he could remember. "I'm Penelope," she said, "but everyone calls me Penny." Behind them, the creek rushed on toward the distant mountains, carrying away the last traces of the violence that had brought them together. Ahead lay nothing but empty grassland and the promise of a sunset that would find them still together, still alive, still bound by the invisible threads that fate had woven around them in the space of a few desperate heartbeats. Nakota didn't know it yet, but his life of solitude had just come to an end. The woman beside him would change everything he thought he knew about honor, loyalty, and the price of love in a world that seemed determined to keep them apart. But for now, in this moment beside the rushing water, all that mattered was that they had both survived. Everything else would have to wait for tomorrow. The sound of distant hoofbeats echoed across the valley, growing closer with each passing second. Someone was coming, and Nakota's hand moved instinctively to his rifle. Whatever happened next, He knew there would be no going back to the simple certainties of his exile. The woman named Penny had brought more than just her life into his hands. When he pulled her from the rapids, she had brought his destiny. Nakota's eyes swept the tree line as he calculated their options. The approaching riders could be anyone, the surviving members of Penny's wagon train, more outlaws drawn by the gunfire, or even cavalry patrols that occasionally swept through this territory, hunting for what they called hostile Indians. None of these possibilities offered much comfort for a Cheyenne warrior traveling with a white woman, who had obviously been through some kind of violent encounter. "Can you ride?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. Penny tested her legs, wincing as she put weight on her left ankle. "I think so. But my horse... The bandits shot him when they attacked our wagon." "Our wagon." The words confirmed what Nakota had already suspected. She had been traveling with others, people who were probably dead or scattered by now. People who would be missed when they failed to reach their destination. He felt the familiar weight of complications settling around him like a trap closing. "How many were with you?" he asked, already moving toward his horse. "My father, his business partner Mr. Caldwell, and 2 hired guards." Her voice caught slightly. "I don't know if any of them, if they're still alive." The hoofbeats were getting closer now, maybe half a mile out and closing fast. Nakota could tell from the rhythm that there were at least 3 riders, possibly more. Too many to fight if they proved hostile, especially with an injured woman to protect. His mind raced through the terrain he had scouted over the past few days, looking for somewhere they could go to ground until the situation became clearer. "There's a box canyon about 2 miles upstream," he said, helping Penny toward his horse. "Hidden entrance, good water, defensible if we need to make a stand." She looked at him with those storm-gray eyes, and he saw intelligence there along with the fear. "You don't have to help me anymore. I know what it means for a Cheyenne warrior to be found with a white woman. If they catch us together... They won't catch us," Nakota said with a certainty he didn't entirely feel. But something in her concern for his welfare, her understanding of the dangers he faced, touched something deep inside him that he had thought was dead forever. He helped her up onto his horse, noting the way she bit her lip to keep from crying out when her injured ankle bumped against a stirrup. Whatever else she might be, Penny Fairmont was no pampered Eastern flower. There was steel in her spine that would serve her well in the trials that lay ahead. Nakota swung up behind her, acutely aware of her warmth against his chest, the faint scent of lavender that somehow survived even after her dunking in the creek. It had been too long since he had been this close to anyone, let alone a woman. The sensation was both comforting and deeply unsettling. He guided the paint horse away from the creek, choosing a route that would take them through the heaviest timber where their trail would be harder to follow. Behind them, the sound of the approaching riders grew steadily louder, and Nakota found himself hoping that whoever was coming would stop to investigate the scene at the wagon crossing rather than immediately picking up their trail as they rode. Through the dappled shadows of the pine forest, Penny spoke quietly without turning around. "Why did you save me? You could have just ridden away." It was a question Nakota had been asking himself since the moment he had spurred his horse toward the creek. The smart answer, the safe answer, would have been to admit that it had been pure impulse, a moment of weakness that he already regretted. But as he felt her leaning back against him, trusting him to keep her safe in a world that had suddenly turned dangerous and unpredictable, he found himself telling her the truth. "My sister," he said simply. "She died because I wasn't there to help her when she needed me most. I swore I would never let that happen again." He felt Penny's sharp intake of breath, felt some of the tension leave her shoulders as she absorbed this information. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "That must have been terrible." "It was a long time ago," Nakota replied, though they both knew that some wounds never really healed, only learned to carry their pain more quietly. They rode in companionable silence. For a while, the paint horse picking its way carefully through the trees while Nakota kept his ears tuned for any sound of pursuit. The afternoon sun slanted through the pine boughs in golden shafts, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out as it circled in search of prey. It was peaceful, almost serene, and Nakota found himself thinking that this was what contentment might feel like, this sense of rightness, of being exactly where he was supposed to be at exactly the right moment. The thought should have alarmed him. Contentment was a luxury he could not afford, not when survival depended on constant vigilance and the willingness to move on at a moment's notice. But with Penny's warmth against his chest, and her trust in his ability to keep her safe, Nakota discovered that some luxuries were worth the risk. "Tell me about the canyon," Penny said as they began climbing toward higher ground. "Is it really defensible?" Nakota considered the question seriously. One way in, one way out. Clear fields of fire, good sight lines. If we have to make a stand, it's better than most places. But if they find us there, we'd be trapped. "Sometimes the best defense is making your enemy come to you on your terms," Nakota replied. "Besides, there are other ways out if you know where to look." He didn't mention that those other ways involved climbing nearly vertical rock faces that would challenge even an experienced mountaineer. If it came to that, they would deal with it when the time came. For now, it was enough that they were putting distance between themselves and whoever was following their trail. The box canyon opened up before them just as the sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon. It was exactly as Nakota remembered. It a narrow cleft in the rocks that widened into a hidden valley, perhaps half a mile long and a quarter-mile wide. A stream bubbled down from the high peaks, creating a small pool surrounded by grass that stayed green even in the driest summers. It was a place that felt separate from the outside world, protected and peaceful in a way that few places in this harsh country ever managed to be. Nakota helped Penny down from the horse and watched as she looked around with obvious appreciation for the canyon's natural beauty. "It's lovely," she said softly. "Like something from a fairy tale." "It's safe," Nakota replied, which in his experience was far more valuable than beauty. Though he had to admit that the combination of the two was particularly appealing, he unsaddled the paint horse and let it drink from the stream while he gathered deadfall for a fire. The nights were getting colder now that summer was waning, and Penny's wet clothes would need the warmth to dry properly. As he worked, he found himself stealing glances at her, watching the way she moved as she explored their temporary sanctuary. She had removed her ruined shoes and was walking barefoot through the grass, her injured ankle apparently not as bad as he had initially feared. Her hair was beginning to dry in the mountain air, revealing highlights of gold and copper that caught the fading sunlight. She was beautiful certainly, but it was more than that. There was something about the way she carried herself, the way she seemed to find wonder even in their desperate circumstances, that drew him like a moth to flame. "Nakota," she said, and he realized she had been speaking to him while he was lost in his observations. "I asked if you thought they would find us here." He felt heat rise in his cheeks and hoped she would attribute it to the smoke from the fire he was building. "Not unless they have a tracker who knows this country better than I do," he said. "The entrance is well hidden, and I covered our trail as best I could." Penny nodded and settled herself on a fallen log near the fire, careful to keep her injured ankle elevated. "What happens if they do find us?" It was a fair question, and one that deserved an honest answer. "Depends on who they are and what they want," Nakota said. "If they're looking for you specifically, we might be able to talk our way out of trouble. If they're just hunting Indians... He didn't finish the sentence. They both knew how that story usually ended. "And what if they're neither?" Penny asked. "What if they're more of the bandits who attacked our wagon?" Nakota touched the stock of his rifle, which never strayed far from his side. "Then we fight." The simple certainty in his voice seemed to reassure her, and she nodded again. "I've never been in a fight before," she admitted. I don't know if I'd be any help. You survived this long, Nakota pointed out. That takes its own kind of courage. As darkness settled over the canyon, they sat by the fire and shared the small amount of food Nakota carried in his saddlebags: jerky, hardtack, and wild berries he had gathered earlier in the day. It wasn't much, but it was enough to take the edge off their hunger. More importantly, it gave them a chance to really talk for the first time since he had pulled her from the creek. "Where were you headed?" Nakota asked as they ate. "Montana Territory," Penny replied. "My father has business interests in the mining camps there. Something about investing in equipment for the gold mines." "Long way from home," Nakota observed. "Boston feels like another world right now," she said with a bitter laugh. "My father thought this trip would be an adventure, a chance to see the frontier before it disappears entirely. I think he was hoping it might cure me of what he calls my rebellious tendencies." "Rebellious how?" Penny was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "I refused to marry the man he chose for me," she said finally. "Edgar Whitman, son of his business partner. Twice my age, twice divorced, and about as interesting as watching paint dry on a barn door." Nakota found himself smiling at her description. The first genuine smile he had felt in months. "So you came west to avoid a marriage you didn't want?" "Something like that," Penny agreed. "Though I have to say, if I'd known it would involve being kidnapped by bandits and nearly drowned in a creek, I might have just stayed home and married Edgar after all." "Would you really?" Nakota asked, and something in his voice made her look at him more carefully. "No," she said after a moment. "No, I don't think I would. Even after everything that's happened today, I'd rather be here, in danger but free to make my own choices than safe in a marriage that would slowly kill my spirit." There was something in the way she said it that told Nakota this was more than just a young woman's rebellion against parental authority. This was someone who had thought deeply about what she wanted from life and was willing to pay the price to get it. He found himself respecting her more with each passing hour. The fire crackled between them, sending sparks up toward the star-filled sky. In the distance, a coyote howled, its voice echoing off the canyon walls like a lonely ghost. It was a sound that usually brought Nakota comfort, a reminder that he was not the only solitary creature trying to make its way in this vast and unforgiving landscape. Tonight, though, with Penny sitting across from him and the memory of her trust still warm in his chest, he found that loneliness held less appeal than it once had. "What about you?" Penny asked. "What brought you to this life of wandering alone?" It was Nakota's turn to stare into the flames, weighing how much of his story he was willing to share. In the end, he found himself telling her more than he had told anyone in the 3 years since his exile began. "I was accused of betraying my people to the cavalry," he said quietly. "Of trading information about war party movements in exchange for army gold." Penny's intake of breath was sharp. "Were you guilty?" The directness of the question should have offended him, but somehow it didn't. "No," he said simply. "But I couldn't prove my innocence, and in times of war, suspicion is often enough. So they cast you out." "After a trial that lasted less than an hour," Nakota confirmed. "I was given a horse, a rifle, and a warning never to return on pain of death." "That's horrible," Penny said, and the genuine sympathy in her voice made something tight in Nakota's chest loosen slightly. "To lose your family, your home, everything you've ever known based on false accusations. It taught me that the only person you can truly depend on is yourself," Nakota replied. "Trust is a luxury I can't afford." "And yet you saved me today," Penny pointed out. "You risked your own safety for a complete stranger." Nakota had no good answer for that observation, so he said nothing. But as he banked the fire for the night and prepared to take first watch while Penny slept, he found himself thinking that maybe, just maybe, some luxuries were worth the risk after all. The night passed peacefully, with no sign of pursuit or danger, But as dawn broke over the canyon walls and Nakota watched Penny wake from sleep with her hair golden in the morning light, he knew that their real troubles were just beginning. Because somewhere out there, people would be looking for the missing daughter of a wealthy Boston businessman. And when they found her in the company of an exiled Cheyenne warrior, all the assumptions and prejudices of two worlds would collide in ways that would test everything he thought he knew about honor, survival, and the price of following his heart. Instead of his head, the morning mist clung to the canyon walls like ghostly fingers when Nakota first heard the dogs. Their distant baying drifted down from the rim above, a sound that made his blood run cold and sent his hand instinctively to his knife. Tracking dogs meant professional hunters, and professional hunters meant someone with serious money and serious motivation was looking for Penelope Fairmont. "Wake up," he said quietly, touching Penny's shoulder where she lay curled beneath his spare blanket near the dying embers of their fire. "We have company coming." She came awake instantly, with none of the confusion or disorientation that marked most people's transition from sleep. Her storm-gray eyes were alert and focused within seconds, taking in his tense posture and the way his gaze kept flicking toward the canyon entrance. "What is it?" she whispered, already moving to gather her things. "Dogs, maybe half a dozen, still a few miles out, but heading this way." Nakota was already saddling his horse, his movements quick and efficient despite the urgency he felt building in his chest. "Someone really wants you back." Penny's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. "My father? Or someone he hired?" Nakota tightened the cinch and checked his rifle one more time. "Either way, they're not going to give up easy. Rich men don't like losing their property." The word property hit Penny like a physical blow, and Nakota saw her flinch. He immediately regretted his choice of words, but there wasn't time to soften the truth. In the eyes of the law, in the eyes of society, in the eyes of whoever was coming after them, that's exactly what she was: valuable property that had gone missing and needed to be recovered. "Where can we go?" she asked, limping slightly as she moved toward the horse. Her ankle was better than yesterday, but still tender. Nakota's mind raced through the possibilities. The obvious route would be north toward the Canadian border, but that meant crossing hundreds of miles of open territory where they would be easy to spot and harder to hide. South meant traveling deeper into settled country where a Cheyenne warrior and a white woman would draw attention wherever they went. East was out of the question entirely. That would take them directly back toward the search parties. "West," he said finally. "Up into the high country. The mountains are rough enough to slow down the dogs, and there are places up there where we can lose them entirely." "What kind of places?" "Old mining camps, abandoned settlements, caves that go back for miles." Nakota helped her up onto the horse, noting that she was moving more easily today despite her injury. "Places where the echo of the dogs barking will confuse them, where our scent will get lost in the wind." As they rode out of the canyon through the narrow entrance, Nakota couldn't shake the feeling that they were leaving something precious behind. The hidden valley had felt safe in a way that few places ever did, a sanctuary where the outside world couldn't touch them. Now they were returning to the harsh reality of being hunted, and he wondered if they would ever find that kind of peace again. The morning sun climbed higher as they made their way up into the foothills, following deer trails and elk paths that wound between towering stands of pine and aspen. The air grew thinner and colder with each mile, and Nakota could see snow gleaming on the highest peaks ahead of them. Winter came early in the high country, and they would need to find shelter and supplies before the first serious storms arrived. "Tell me about your father," Nakota said as they paused to rest the horse near a mountain stream. "What kind of man is he?" Penny's expression darkened. "The kind who sees everything in terms of profit and loss," she said bitterly. "People are investments to him, relationships are business transactions. He probably has my entire life planned out in a ledger somewhere, complete with projected returns. Rich man's thinking, Nakota observed. Everything has a price. Everyone can be bought. Exactly. Penny dipped her hands in the stream and splashed cold water on her face. That's why he can't understand my refusal to marry Edgar Whitman. In his mind, it's a perfectly logical business arrangement. Edgar gets a young wife to bear his children and manage his household. My father gets access to the Whitman shipping fortune, and I get security and social position. What more could any reasonable woman want? Freedom, Nakota said quietly. The right to choose your own path. Penny looked at him with surprise, as if she hadn't expected him to understand something so fundamental to her situation. Yes, she said simply. Freedom. The sound of the dogs was getting closer now. No longer a distant baying, but a focused, purposeful howling that spoke of a hot trail and eager hunters. Nakota estimated they had maybe an hour before the search party reached the canyon, maybe 2 hours before they picked up the trail leading into the mountains. Not much time to put distance between themselves and their pursuers. There's something else you need to know, Penny said as they prepared to move on. About my father, about why he's so determined to get me back. Nakota waited, sensing that whatever she was about to tell him would change everything. He's not just a businessman, she continued. He's a United States Marshal, appointed by the federal government to oversee territorial law enforcement. He has resources at his disposal that most fathers don't. The revelation hit Nakota like a physical blow. A wealthy businessman was one thing. Such men hired private detectives and bounty hunters, dangerous but ultimately limited in their authority. A federal marshal was something else entirely. That meant official pursuit, legal authority to deputize as many men as needed, and the backing of the entire territorial government. Why didn't you tell me this yesterday? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Because you would have left me, Penny said with brutal honesty. And I couldn't bear the thought of being alone again. Nakota studied her face, looking for any sign of deception or manipulation. What he saw instead was raw vulnerability, the admission of someone who had been abandoned too many times to trust easily. It reminded him of his own exile, his own desperate hunger for human connection after too many months of solitude. I'm not leaving you now, he said, and meant it. Relief flooded Penny's features, followed immediately by guilt. Even though I lied to you, you didn't lie, Nakota pointed out. You just didn't tell me everything. There's a difference. Is there? You're risking your life for me, and I let you do it without knowing the full danger. Nakota considered this as he helped her back onto the horse. We all have secrets, he said finally. Things we keep hidden because the truth is too dangerous or too painful to share. The question isn't whether you told me everything yesterday. The question is whether you're telling me the truth now. I am, Penny said firmly. Everything I've told you is true. Then that's enough for now. They rode higher into the mountains, following a trail that grew increasingly treacherous as the terrain became more vertical. The paint horse was sure-footed and strong, but even the best mountain horse had its limits. Nakota knew they would have to find shelter soon, both for the animal's sake and because the temperature was dropping rapidly as they gained altitude. There, he said, pointing to a narrow ledge about halfway up a sheer cliff face. See that dark opening? It's a cave system I found last spring. Goes back for miles with multiple entrances. We can lose the dogs in there. Penny looked up at the intimidating climb ahead of them. How do we get up there? Very carefully, Nakota replied. And we leave the horse behind. It was a painful decision. The paint had been his companion for over 2 years, and leaving it meant sacrificing their mobility and their ability to carry supplies. But tracking dogs could follow a horse's scent for days, while human scent on bare rock would dissipate much more quickly. Nakota unsaddled the horse and turned it loose near a small meadow where the grass was still green and water was available. The animal would survive on its own. Wild horses had been roaming these mountains for generations. But watching it trot away into the trees felt like severing another connection to his former life. "Ready?" he asked, shouldering his pack and rifle. Penny nodded, though he could see the fear in her eyes as she looked up at the cliff face. "I've never done anything like this before. Stay close behind me," Nakota instructed. "Step where I step, hold what I hold. Don't look down, and don't think about anything except the next handhold." The climb was every bit as treacherous as it looked. The rock was loose in places, solid in others, and it took all of Nakota's experience reading stone to find the safest route upward. Penny surprised him with her determination and natural agility. She might have been raised in Boston drawing rooms, but she had the instincts and courage of a born climber. They were about 20 feet up when the first dog appeared at the base of the cliff below them. It was a massive blue-tick hound, bred for trailing and built for endurance. Its bay echoed off the cliff walls as it caught their scent, and within minutes it was joined by 5 more dogs and their handlers. Nakota could see them clearly from his position on the rock face, hard men in trail clothes, carrying rifles, and wearing the sort of determined expressions that came with substantial bounties. "Well, well," called out one of the men, a tall figure with a silver badge glinting on his vest. "Looks like we found our missing princes." Nakota felt Penny tense. Above him on the cliff, the man with the badge had to be her father, U.S. Marshal Thomas Fairmont. Even from a distance, Nakota could see the family resemblance in the set of his jaw and the storm gray color of his eyes. "Come down from there, Penelope," Marshal Fairmont called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "This foolishness has gone on long enough." "I'm not coming back, Father," Penny called down, and Nakota was impressed by the steadiness of her voice despite their precarious position. "Not to you, not to Edgar, not to any of it." "You don't have a choice in the matter," Fairmont replied. "You're a minor child, and you're coming home whether you like it or not." "I'm 22 years old," Penny shot back. "I haven't been a minor for 4 years. You are my daughter, and as long as you're unmarried, you're under my legal authority," Fairmont countered. "Now stop being dramatic and come down before someone gets hurt." Nakota could feel the tension radiating from Penny's body where she clung to the rock above him. This wasn't just about an unwanted marriage anymore. This was about power, control, and a father who couldn't accept that his daughter was old enough to make her own choices. "What about your companion?" Fairmont continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Does he know what the penalty is for kidnapping a federal marshal's daughter?" "He didn't kidnap me," Penny called down. "He saved my life." "Funny how that looks." "The same from down here," said another voice, and Nakota's blood chilled as he recognized the speaker. Deputy Marshal John Crawford, a man with a reputation for violence and a particular hatred for Indians. Nakota had encountered him once before, 2 years ago, and had been lucky to escape with his life. "Well, if it isn't the famous Nakota," Crawford continued, his voice dripping with malicious satisfaction. "Thought you'd learn to stay away from white folks after what happened to your sister." The words hit Nakota like a physical blow, and he felt his grip on the rock face falter for a moment. Crawford knew about his sister, about the circumstances of her death, about the guilt that had driven him into exile. "How is that possible?" "That's right," Crawford continued, clearly enjoying Nakota's reaction. "We know all about you, warrior. Know about the night you led that cavalry patrol to your own people's winter camp. Know about how your sister died trying to warn them. Know about how they cast you out when they found out what you'd done." "That's not true," Penny said fiercely, looking down at Nakota with eyes full of protective fury. "Tell them it's not true." But Nakota couldn't speak. The memories were flooding back, that terrible night when everything had gone wrong, when his attempt to negotiate peace had turned into tragedy, when his sister had paid the ultimate price for his naivety. He had told Penny he was innocent. of betraying his people. And that was true. But innocent didn't mean blameless, and Crawford's version of events was close enough to the truth to reopen old wounds. "Oh, he didn't tell you the whole story?" Crawford laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "How sweet." The noble savage and the innocent maiden, riding off into the sunset. "Too bad it's all built on lies." "Enough, Crawford," Marshal Fairmont said sharply. "We're here to retrieve my daughter, not relitigate old grievances." But the damage was done. Nakota could feel Penny's eyes on him, could sense her confusion and growing doubt. The trust they had built over the past day was cracking under the weight of his concealed past, and he knew that once it broke completely, there would be no repairing it. "I think our Indian friend is having second thoughts," Crawford observed. "Maybe he's realized that some prizes aren't worth the price." The deputy's words were clearly intended to drive a wedge between Nakota and Penny, and Nakota could feel them working. The silence from above told him that Penny was processing what she had heard, trying to reconcile the man who had saved her life with the picture Crawford was painting. "Is it true?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the wind. "About your sister?" Nakota closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 3 years' worth of guilt pressing down on him like the mountain itself. He had known this moment would come eventually, the moment when his past caught up with him and destroyed whatever chance he had at redemption. He just hadn't expected it to hurt this much. "Yes," he said simply. "She died because of choices I made." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind whistling through the rocks and the sound of the dogs pacing restlessly below. Nakota waited for Penny to pull away from him, to start climbing down toward her father and the life she had been trying to escape. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. Everything Crawford had said was designed to show her that Nakota was exactly the kind of dangerous man her father had always warned her about. Instead, her hand appeared in his field of vision, pale, delicate, but steady as granite. "Then we climb faster," she said. The simple statement, the absolute trust it implied, nearly broke Nakota's composure entirely. He looked up at her, searching her face for any sign of doubt or fear. What he saw instead was determination, loyalty, and something that might have been the beginning of love. "You don't understand," he said. "What Crawford said, I understand perfectly," Penny interrupted. "You made choices that had consequences you didn't intend. You lost someone you loved because of those choices. You've been punishing yourself ever since." She paused, her gray eyes holding his with unwavering intensity. "None of that changes who you are now, or what you did for me yesterday." Below them, Crawford was growing impatient. "Time's up, Princess. You coming down, or do we have to come up and get you?" "You can try," Nakota called down, his voice carrying a note of challenge that made the dogs below whine nervously. "But I wouldn't recommend it." The threat was mostly bluff. They were in an extremely vulnerable position on the cliff face, and any kind of confrontation would likely end badly for everyone involved. But sometimes bluffs worked, especially when backed by a reputation for dangerous competence. "Cover me," he whispered to Penny. "We're going up fast." What followed was the most harrowing 10 minutes of Nakota's life. They climbed with desperate speed, using every technique he had learned in years of mountain travel. Penny matched him move for move, her fear transformed into pure determination. Below them, Crawford and his men tried to find their own route up the cliff, but they were heavy, loud, and unfamiliar with the terrain. The mouth of the cave appeared above them just as Nakota's strength was beginning to fail. He hauled himself over the ledge and immediately turned to help Penny up, pulling her into the blessed darkness just as the first rifle shot echoed off the cliff walls. They were safe for now. But as they caught their breath in the cool darkness of the cave, both of them knew that the real test was just beginning. Because somewhere in the tunnels ahead lay either freedom or a trap from which there would be no escape. And outside, Marshal Fairmont and his men were already looking for another way up. The cave system stretched into absolute darkness beyond the reach of sunlight, a labyrinth of limestone passages carved by countless centuries of underground rivers. Nakota had explored perhaps a quarter mile of these tunnels during his previous visit, but he knew from the constant whisper of moving air that they extended much deeper into the mountain's heart. Now, as he and Penny caught their breath in the blessed safety of the cave mouth, that unknown darkness represented both salvation and potential doom. "How far back do they go?" Penny whispered, her voice barely audible but still seeming to echo. "In the confined space." "I don't know," Nakota admitted, checking his rifle to make sure the climb hadn't damaged it. "But there's air moving through here, which means there are other openings somewhere ahead. The question is whether we can find them before your father's men find another way up to this ledge." Even as he spoke, they could hear voices echoing up from below. Marshal Fairmont was organizing his men, sending some to search for alternate routes while others established a perimeter around the base of the cliff. The marshal was nothing if not thorough, and Nakota suspected the man had dealt with desperate fugitives before. "We should move deeper," Penny said, already gathering herself to stand despite the exhaustion that was evident in every line of her body. "Staying here makes us sitting ducks if they find another way up." Nakota nodded, impressed once again by her practical thinking under pressure. Most people, finding themselves trapped in an unknown cave system, would want to stay as close to the entrance as possible. But Penny understood instinctively that their only real safety lay in the unknown depths ahead. He pulled a pitch torch from his pack and struck a spark with his flint and steel. The flame caught immediately, casting dancing shadows on the rough limestone walls and revealing the mouth of a passage that led deeper into the mountain. The tunnel was wide enough for them to walk side by side, carved smooth by the passage of ancient waters that had long since found other channels. "Stay close," Nakota warned as they began walking into the darkness. "These caves can be treacherous. Sudden drops, false passages, places where the air turns bad. And we need to be quiet. Sound carries a long way underground." They moved in relative silence for the first few hundred yards, the torch flame their only protection against the absolute darkness that pressed around them like a living thing. The air was cool and damp, carrying the mineral scent of deep stone and the faint sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance. Their footsteps echoed softly despite their efforts to move quietly, and Nakota found himself thinking that this was what it might feel like to walk through the underworld itself. "Nakota," Penny said softly as they paused at a junction where the main passage split into 3 separate tunnels. "What Deputy Crawford said about your sister. Will you tell me what really happened?" It was a question he had been dreading since the moment Crawford had revealed his knowledge of those terrible events. The truth was complicated, painful, and cast him in a light that few people could forgive. But as he looked at Penny's face in the flickering torchlight, he realized that she had earned the right to know. She had chosen to trust him despite Crawford's accusations. The least he could do was trust her with the complete story. 3 years ago, tensions between my people and the cavalry were reaching a breaking point, he began, choosing the middle passage more by instinct than any real knowledge of where it led. Both sides were looking for any excuse to start shooting. I thought I could prevent that. They walked as he talked, their footsteps creating a steady rhythm that seemed to help him find the words for memories he had tried to bury. There was a young cavalry officer, Lieutenant Morrison, who had been trying to negotiate with the tribal elders. He seemed different from the others, genuinely interested in finding a peaceful solution rather than just looking for glory. When he approached me privately, asking for my help in arranging a meeting with the war chiefs, I thought it was our chance to avoid bloodshed. The passage they were following began to slope downward, and Nakota could hear the sound of running water growing stronger ahead of them. Somewhere in the darkness, an underground river was flowing towards some unknown destination. I arranged the meeting, he continued, his voice growing heavier with each word. Convinced the war chiefs that Morrison could be trusted, that this was our opportunity to negotiate from a position of strength rather than desperation. The meeting was set for our winter camp, in a sacred place where violence was forbidden by tribal law. Penny stumbled slightly on the uneven floor, and Nakota caught her arm to steady her. The brief contact reminded him of how much had changed in the short time since he had pulled her from the creek. Then, he had been a man with nothing left to lose. Now, with her trust and growing affection, he was discovering that he had more to lose than ever. Morrison came to the meeting as agreed, Nakota said, as they reached the underground river, a stream perhaps 10 feet wide that flowed swiftly through a channel carved deep into the stone floor. But he wasn't alone. Unknown to me, he had been followed by his commanding officer, Colonel Harrison, and a full company of cavalry. Harrison had never had any intention of negotiating. He was using Morrison's idealism and my cooperation to locate our winter camp so he could attack it. They followed the stream, walking along a narrow ledge that had been carved by centuries of high water. The torch flame reflected off the black water, creating an eerie doubling effect that made the darkness seem even more profound. The attack came at dawn, Nakota continued, his voice now barely above a whisper. I was still asleep when the shooting started. By the time I understood what was happening, it was too late to warn anyone. My sister, Ayana, tried to reach the children's lodge to get them to safety. She was cut down by cavalry fire before she made it halfway across the camp circle. Penny's sharp intake of breath echoed off the cave walls. Oh, Nakota, I'm so sorry. She died believing I had betrayed our people, he said, and the words tasted like ashes in his mouth. The last thing she said to me was why, and I had no answer for her. They walked in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the rush of the underground river and the distant drip of water from unseen stalactites. Finally, Penny spoke again. But you didn't betray anyone. You were trying to make peace. Intent doesn't matter when people are dead, Nakota replied. Morrison was devastated when he realized how he had been used. He tried to stop the attack, but Harrison had him arrested for insubordination. The lieutenant died in military prison 6 months later, supposedly of fever, though there were rumors of suicide. And your people blamed you for the attack. They were right to blame me, Nakota said with bitter certainty. I was the one who trusted Morrison. I was the one who convinced the war chiefs to meet in the winter camp. If I had been more careful, more suspicious, Ayana would still be alive. The underground river took a sharp turn to the left, and their narrow ledge widened into a broader chamber. Nakota held the torch higher, revealing a cavern perhaps 50 feet across with multiple passages leading off in different directions. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above them, and the sound of their voices echoed strangely in the vast space. That's why you were exiled, Penny said, understanding dawning in her voice. Not because you were a traitor, but because your attempt at peacemaking had terrible consequences. The tribal council voted, Nakota confirmed. Some wanted me executed as a collaborator. Others argued that my intentions had been honorable, even if the results were disastrous. Exile was the compromise. I would live, but I would live alone, cut off from everything and everyone I had ever cared about. They chose the passage that seemed to slope upward, hoping it might lead to another exit. The air was fresher here, carrying hints of pine and mountain air that suggested they were getting closer to the surface. But it was impossible to know if they were moving toward freedom or simply finding another dead end. So you've been wandering alone for 3 years, Penny said as they climbed through a narrow passage that required them to move single file. Carrying all that guilt, all that grief, with no one to share it with. It seemed like appropriate punishment, Nakota replied. A life for a life. My sister died because of my choices, so I would live without the connections that make life worth living. That's not justice, Penny said fiercely. That's just cruelty. To yourself and to anyone who might have benefited from knowing you." Her words stirred something in Nakota's chest that he had thought was dead forever. Not absolution, he would never forgive himself for Ayana's death, but perhaps the possibility that his guilt didn't have to define the rest of his existence. Perhaps there was still some good he could do in the world, some way to honor his sister's memory other than simply suffering. The passage they were following opened suddenly into another large chamber, this one illuminated by a shaft of natural light streaming down from somewhere high above. It was a welcome sight after hours in the torchlit darkness, and both of them paused to appreciate the sensation of real sunlight on their faces. "Look," Penny said, pointing to the far side of the chamber. "Is that another way out?" Nakota followed her gaze and saw what appeared to be a natural ramp leading upward toward a patch of sky visible through a break in the stone. It wasn't exactly an exit. The opening was perhaps 20 feet above the chamber floor, but it was definitely a connection to the surface world. "It might be," he agreed, extinguishing the torch to conserve their limited supply of light. "But we'll need to climb again, and this time there won't be solid rock to hold on to." The ramp was indeed treacherous, composed of loose stone and gravel that shifted treacherously underfoot. They made their way up carefully, testing each step before committing their full weight. Penny's injured ankle was clearly bothering her more as the day wore on, but she never complained or asked to rest. As they climbed, they could hear new sounds filtering down from above, not the voices of Marshal Fairmont's search party, but something else entirely. The lowing of cattle, the creak of wagon wheels, the familiar sounds of a traveling herd moving across the landscape. "Cattle drive," Nakota said, recognizing the sounds immediately. "Probably heading north to the railroad in Montana Territory." "How many men would be with a herd like that?" Penny asked. "Depends on the size of the herd. Could be anywhere from 6 or 8 cowboys to 20 or more if it's a major operation." Nakota paused in his climbing to consider their options. "Cattle drives mean neutral territory. Cowboys don't generally take sides in family disputes or federal manhunts. They're too focused on getting their herd to market." "Could we join them?" Penny asked hopefully. "At least until we're well clear of my father's search area." It was a possibility Nakota hadn't considered, but it had merit. Cattle drives were temporary communities unto themselves, with their own codes and loyalties that often superseded outside authority. If they could convince the trail boss to take them on, it would provide cover and protection that they couldn't achieve on their own. "It's risky," he admitted. "Some trail bosses are sticklers for the law. Others are more interested in practical considerations, extra hands, someone who knows the country, reasons to avoid getting involved in other people's troubles." They reached the opening just as the sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon. The break in the stone was indeed an exit, though a narrow and difficult one that required them to squeeze through a gap barely wide enough for their shoulders. But beyond it lay freedom, a high meadow where hundreds of longhorn cattle grazed under the watchful eyes of mounted cowboys. Nakota studied the scene carefully before committing to their course of action. The herd was large, maybe 800 head, which meant this was a serious commercial operation rather than a small family outfit. The cowboys he could see looked professional and well-armed, the kind of men who could handle trouble when it arose. The chuck wagon and remuda of spare horses were positioned on the far side of the meadow, suggesting they were preparing to camp for the night. "The trail boss will be the one near the chuck wagon," Nakota told Penny as they prepared to make their approach. "Let me do the talking initially. Cowboys can be suspicious of strangers, especially when one of them is a well-dressed woman traveling with an Indian. What will you tell them? The truth, mostly. That you're running from an unwanted marriage, that we need to get north to Montana Territory, that we can work for our passage." Nakota checked his rifle one more time, making sure it was ready but not obviously threatening. "Cowboys respect honesty and hard work. If we can convince them we're both, we might have a chance. They emerged from the cave opening and began walking across the meadow toward the distant chuck wagon. Almost immediately, several of the cowboys noticed their approach and began riding in their direction. Nakota kept his hands visible and his posture non-threatening, but he was acutely aware that they were approaching armed men who had every reason to be suspicious of strangers. The lead cowboy was a man in his 40s with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades in the saddle. He wore his authority with quiet confidence, and Nakota recognized him immediately as the trail boss. "Afternoon," the man said, reining in his horse about 10 feet away. "Name's Jake. Sullivan, this is my herd, and you're trespassing on my grazing land." "My apologies," Nakota replied respectfully. "I'm Nakota, and this is Penny. We're travelers heading north, and we were hoping you might have work for a couple of extra hands." Sullivan's eyes moved between them, taking in Nakota's obvious Indian heritage and Penny's expensive but ruined dress. "Interesting combination," he said finally. "You two married?" It was a logical question, and one that Nakota had been expecting. In the frontier culture, unmarried men and women simply didn't travel together unless there were exceptional circumstances. Their answer would determine how the cowboys treated them and whether Sullivan would even consider their request. "We're—" Nakota began, then stopped, realizing he wasn't sure how to define their relationship. "We're planning to be," Penny said firmly, stepping closer to Nakota and taking his arm in a gesture that looked both natural and possessive. "As soon as we reach Montana territory." Sullivan nodded, apparently satisfied with this explanation. "And what kind of work experience do you folks have?" "I know cattle," Nakota said. "Grew up around horses, can handle a rope, not afraid of hard work. Penny here is educated, can read and write, handle numbers if you need help with the books. And you're both running from something," Sullivan observed shrewdly. "Don't bother denying it. I can see it in your eyes. Question is, what kind of trouble are you bringing to my herd?" Before Nakota could answer, the sound of distant gunshots echoed across the valley. Marshal Fairmont's men had apparently found another way into the cave system and were now searching the tunnels. It was only a matter of time before they emerged and picked up the trail. "The kind that pays federal wages to anyone who helps with the capturing," Penny said with bitter honesty. "My father is a U.S. Marshal, and he wants me back home for an arranged marriage I don't want." Sullivan's expression didn't change, but Nakota saw several of the other cowboys exchange glances. This was the moment of truth. Either the trail boss would decide their troubles were too dangerous to get involved with, or he would see an opportunity. "Federal marshals pay better than most," Sullivan said finally. "But they also cause more trouble than they're worth." "How much of a head start do we have?" "Maybe an hour if we're lucky," Nakota replied. Sullivan nodded and turned to one of his men. "Pete, get these folks some horses and gear." "We're moving out early, boss?" Pete questioned. "We were planning to camp here tonight. Plans change," Sullivan said firmly. "I've got a contract to deliver this herd to Miles City by the end of the month, and I don't intend to let a family squabble slow us down. We'll drive through the night and put some distance between us and whatever's coming behind." As the cowboys sprang into action, preparing for an unexpected night drive, Nakota felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. For the first time since his exile began, he wasn't facing the world alone. He had Penny beside him, trusted companions around him, and a purpose beyond mere survival. But as he helped Penny mount the horse Pete brought for her, he couldn't shake the feeling that their real troubles were just beginning. Marshal Fairmont was not a man who gave up easily, and sooner or later, he would catch up with them. When that happened, all the temporary alliances and borrowed courage in the world wouldn't be enough to protect what they were building together. Still, as the Longhorn herd began moving north under a star-filled sky, Nakota allowed himself to hope that perhaps, after 3 years of wandering in the wilderness, he had finally found his way home. 3 days into the cattle drive, Nakota began to notice the signs. Small things at first: cowboys who stopped talking when he approached, sideways glances that lingered too long, the way trail boss Sullivan kept checking his pocket watch as if expecting something. The herd was making good time northward through the Montana Territory, but there was an undercurrent of tension that had nothing to do with the challenges of moving 800 head of longhorn cattle across difficult terrain. Penny felt it too. He could see it in the way she stayed closer to him during the day, in how her hand never strayed far from the small revolver Sullivan had given her for protection. She had taken to the cowboy life with surprising ease, helping Cookie with the meals and proving herself useful around the chuck wagon. But beneath her growing confidence, Nakota sensed the same unease that was gnawing at his own instincts. It was Pete Morrison, one of the younger cowboys, who finally confirmed his suspicions. The boy, he couldn't have been more than 19, approached Nakota during the noon rest while most of the other hands were seeing to their horses or grabbing a quick meal. "You need to know something," Pete said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. Sullivan sent her rider back toward the caves yesterday morning, early, before most folks were awake. Nakota's blood turned to ice water in his veins. "What kind of rider?" "Tommy Hutchins. Fast horse. Light pack. The kind of setup you use when you need to cover ground quick and get back with news." Pete's young face was troubled, torn between loyalty to his trail boss and what his conscience was telling him was right. "I heard Sullivan tell him to find Marshal Fairmont's search party and give them our route north." The betrayal hit Nakota like a physical blow, not because it was unexpected. He had learned long ago that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, but because it meant dragging Penny back into immediate danger. For 3 days they had been living in a bubble of relative safety, sleeping under the stars, working side by side, beginning to build something that felt almost like a normal life. Now that bubble was about to burst in the most violent way possible. "Why are you telling me this?" Nakota asked, studying the young cowboy's face for any sign of deception. "Because Miss Penny don't deserve what's coming," Pete replied with the simple honesty of youth. "And because I got a sister back home who ran off to escape a marriage she didn't want. I know what it looks like when a woman's scared and desperate. And I know what it looks like when she finds someone who makes her feel safe again." Nakota felt a surge of gratitude toward the young man, mixed with regret for what his warning would cost. "How long do we have?" "Hutchins rode out yesterday morning. If he found the marshal's party right away, they could be here by tomorrow evening. Maybe sooner if they push hard." Pete shifted nervously, clearly unhappy with his role as bearer of bad news. "Sullivan's been slowing the herd down today, making excuses about letting the cattle graze. I think he's trying to give them time to catch up." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Sullivan had never intended to help them escape. He had been playing a longer game from the beginning, using the cattle drive as bait to draw them into a trap where Marshal Fairmont could take them without a running fight. It was actually a clever plan, and Nakota found himself respecting the trail boss's strategic thinking, even as he cursed the man's duplicity. "Does anyone else know?" Nakota asked. "A few of the older hands, probably. The ones who've been with Sullivan for years." Pete looked miserable. "Most of us just thought we were helping folks in trouble. We didn't know about the federal marshal angle until after you'd already joined up." Nakota clapped the young man on the shoulder, a gesture of thanks that seemed to ease some of Pete's obvious guilt. "You did the right thing telling me. Now you need to forget we had this conversation and act like nothing's changed. What are you going to do?" It was a fair question, and one that Nakota didn't have a good answer for. Running would mean abandoning the protection of the herd and striking out on foot across hostile territory with limited supplies and no clear destination. Staying would mean waiting for Marshal Fairmont to arrive with enough men and legal authority to end their flight permanently. Neither option offered much hope for success. I don't know yet, Nakota admitted. But whatever happens, you and the other boys who didn't know about this need to stay clear. When the shooting starts, and it will start, don't get caught in the middle. Pete nodded solemnly and walked away, leaving Nakota alone with the terrible knowledge of what was coming. He stood there for a moment, watching the cattle graze peacefully in the afternoon sun, before making his way back to where Penny was helping Cookie clean the lunch dishes. She took one look at his face and immediately set down the tin plate she was holding. "What's wrong? We need to talk," Nakota said quietly. "Somewhere private." They walked to the edge of the herd, ostensibly checking on some cattle that had wandered toward a nearby creek. Once they were out of earshot of the other cowboys, Nakota told her what Pete had revealed. He watched her face as the implications sank in, saw the moment when hope died in her storm-gray eyes and was replaced by something harder and more determined. "How long do we have?" she asked, echoing the same question he had posed to Pete. "Until tomorrow evening, maybe sooner." Nakota studied the terrain around them, automatically cataloging possible escape routes and defensive positions. "Your father will come with enough men to make resistance seem pointless. He'll offer terms you go back with him willingly, and I get to ride away alive. And if I refuse, then people start dying, beginning with me." Nakota's voice was flat, matter of fact. "Your father isn't a cruel man, but he's a federal marshal with a job to do. He won't let sentiment interfere with his duty." Penny was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the vast expanse of grassland that stretched to the horizon in every direction. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of steel that reminded Nakota of her father. "There's something I haven't told you," she said, "about Edgar Whitman, the man my father wants me to marry." Nakota waited, sensing that whatever she was about to reveal would change everything yet again. "He's not just wealthy," Penny continued. "He's also politically connected, very connected. There are rumors that he's being considered for a territorial judgeship, maybe even a federal appointment when Montana becomes a state." She turned to face Nakota directly. "My father isn't just trying to arrange a profitable marriage. He's trying to secure his own political future." The revelation added a new dimension to their situation. This wasn't just about a stubborn daughter and an arranged marriage. This was about power, influence, and the kind of political calculations that could make or break careers in territorial politics. Marshal Fairmont wasn't pursuing them out of paternal concern alone. He was protecting an investment in his own advancement. "That explains why he's willing to commit so many resources to bringing you back," Nakota said grimly. "And why he won't accept any outcome except complete success. It also means he can't afford to let you live," Penny said with brutal honesty. "A Cheyenne warrior who helped his daughter escape an arranged marriage? That's exactly the kind of scandal that could destroy his reputation among the territorial elite." They stood together in silence, watching the cattle move slowly across the grassland, while the weight of their impossible situation settled around them like a shroud. Every option seemed to lead to the same inevitable conclusion: capture, separation, and probably death for at least one of them. "There might be another way," Penny said suddenly, her voice taking on the tone of someone who had just thought of something desperate but possible. "What kind of way?" "The Crow Reservation is about 40 miles northeast of here," she said, speaking quickly as the idea took shape in her mind. "I remember seeing it on the maps my father showed me before we left Boston. If we could reach it, ... The Army can't pursue us onto reservation land without tribal permission," Nakota finished, understanding immediately where her thoughts were leading. "And the Crow have no love for federal marshals who exceed their authority." It was a long shot, but it was better than anything else they had considered. The Crow had been traditional enemies of the Cheyenne, but that ancient rivalry mattered less now than their shared desire to keep white authority from intruding on their remaining sovereignty. If Nakota and Penny could reach the reservation boundaries, they would be beyond Marshal Fairmont's immediate reach. 40 miles across open country, Nakota mused, calculating distances and timing in his head. On foot, carrying only what we can pack light. No water sources that I know of between here and there. Better than waiting here for my father to arrive with a small army, Penny pointed out. She was right, of course. It was a desperate plan with a dozen ways it could go wrong, but it was better than the certainty of capture if they stayed with the herd. And there was something else, something that Nakota didn't want to examine too closely, the idea of finally standing up and fighting back instead of simply running away. We'd have to leave tonight, he said. After the camp settles down, but before Sullivan posts the night guards who are really watching for us instead of cattle thieves. How do we get past the sentries? Nakota smiled grimly. The same way I used to slip past cavalry patrols when I was scouting for the tribe. Very carefully and with a lot of luck. They spent the rest of the afternoon making quiet preparations. Nakota convinced Cookie to let him help with the evening meal preparation, using the opportunity to pocket supplies that wouldn't be missed until morning. Penny claimed to be feeling unwell and retired early to the bedroll they had been sharing, giving her an excuse to organize their few possessions without attracting attention. As the sun set and the cowboys settled in for the night, Nakota felt the familiar tension that came before action. It was a feeling he remembered from his warrior days, that combination of fear and anticipation that sharpened the senses and focused the mind on the immediate necessities of survival. Sullivan approached their bedroll around 9 o'clock, ostensibly to check on Penny's health, but actually to confirm they were both still in camp. The trail boss was too experienced to rely on assumptions when dealing with dangerous fugitives. Feeling any better, miss? Sullivan asked, his voice carrying just the right note of concern to sound genuine. A little, Penny replied weakly, playing her part perfectly. I think I just need rest. Good to hear. We'll be making an early start tomorrow. Want to cover as much ground as possible before the heat gets too bad. Sullivan's eyes flicked to Nakota. You planning to take first watch on the remuda tonight? If you need me to, Nakota replied, keeping his voice neutral despite the suspicion he could feel radiating from the trail boss. I think we can manage without you tonight. You stay close and make sure Miss Penny gets the rest she needs. It was as close to a direct order as Sullivan could make it without revealing his true intentions. Nakota nodded and settled back against his saddle, projecting an image of weary compliance, while his mind raced through the final details of their escape. Plan. 2 hours after the camp fell quiet, they made their move. The escape began perfectly. Moving like shadows through the sleeping camp, Nakota and Penny slipped past the drowsing guards and faded into the darkness beyond the remuda's perimeter. They had covered perhaps 2 miles across the moonlit grassland when everything went catastrophically wrong. The sound that shattered the night silence wasn't the baying of tracking dogs or the thunder of pursuing hoofbeats. It was something far worse, the sharp crack of a rifle shot followed immediately by Penny's cry of pain as she stumbled and fell to theppery grass. Blood, black in the moonlight, spread across her left shoulder where the bullet had found its mark. Well, well, came a familiar voice from the darkness ahead of them. Looks like the little princes decided to go for a midnight stroll. Deputy Marshal John Crawford emerged from a stand of sagebrush, his rifle still smoking in his hands. Behind him came 4 more men, all armed and moving with the practiced coordination of experienced manhunters. They had been waiting in ambush, positioned perfectly to intercept any attempt at escape from the cattle camp. Surprised to see me? Crawford continued, his voice carrying that same note of malicious satisfaction that Nakota remembered from their encounter at the cliff. Marshal Fairmont thought you might try something clever like this. Turns out federal lawmen know how to think ahead too. Nakota knelt beside Penny, pressing his hand against her wounded shoulder to slow the bleeding while his mind raced through their rapidly diminishing options. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of her shoulder without hitting bone, but she was losing blood and would need medical attention soon. More importantly, they were surrounded by armed men in open terrain with nowhere to run and no cover to speak of. "Let me tend to her wound," Nakota said, his voice carefully controlled despite the rage building in his chest. "Then we'll come with you peacefully." "Oh, I don't think so," Crawford replied with a cold smile. "See, the marshal gave me very specific instructions about how to handle this situation. Miss Fairmont goes back alive and unharmed, well, mostly unharmed," he added with a glance at her bleeding shoulder. "But you, warrior, you're a different story entirely." The deputy's meaning was unmistakably clear. Marshal Fairmont had decided that the political risks of leaving Nakota alive outweighed any legal niceties about due process or territorial jurisdiction. This wasn't going to be an arrest. It was going to be an execution disguised as resisting capture. "He's unarmed," Penny gasped, struggling to sit up despite her wound. "He's not resisting. You can't just murder him in cold blood." "Murder?" Crawford laughed, the sound harsh and ugly in the night air. "Miss, this here's a dangerous Cheyenne renegade who kidnapped a federal marshal's daughter and shot at law enforcement officers during the pursuit. When he tried to escape custody and threatened your safety, we had no choice but to defend ourselves." It was a practiced lie, delivered with the smooth confidence of a man who had told similar stories before. Nakota realized that Crawford had probably been planning this moment since their first encounter at the cliff, savoring the opportunity to kill a man he saw as representing everything he hated about the changing frontier. "There's just one problem with your story," came a new voice from the darkness behind Crawford's men. "You forgot to check if anyone was listening." Jake Sullivan stepped into the moonlight, his own rifle trained on Crawford's back. Behind him came Pete Morrison and 3 other cowboys, all armed and clearly prepared for a fight. The trail boss's face was grim but determined, the expression of a man who had made a difficult decision and was prepared to live with the consequences. "Sullivan," Crawford snarled, spinning around to face this unexpected threat. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" "Preventing a murder," Sullivan replied calmly. "See, I may have made a deal with Marshal Fairmont, but cold-blooded killing wasn't part of the arrangement. The plan was to deliver these folks alive and unharmed, not stage some kind of frontier execution. The Marshal's orders were very clear." Crawford insisted, but Nakota could see uncertainty creeping into the deputy's posture. The tactical situation had shifted dramatically, and what had been a simple ambush was now a complex standoff with unclear loyalties. "Maybe they were," Sullivan agreed. "But I don't take orders from deputy marshals, especially ones with reputations for exceeding their authority. If Marshal Fairmont wants to explain to a territorial judge why his deputy shot an prisoner, that's between him and the courts." The tension stretched like a wire about to snap. 6 men with rifles facing each other across 20 yards of moonlit grassland, while Penny bled slowly into the prairie grass. Nakota could feel the violence building in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm, and he knew that once the shooting started, there would be no controlling who lived or died. "Pete," he said quietly, without taking his eyes off Crawford, "there's a field dressing in my saddlebag. Miss Penny needs it before she bleeds out." The young cowboy moved carefully toward where Nakota had dropped their supplies, his rifle never wavering from its target. But as he knelt to search through the pack, Crawford made his decision. "Enough of this," the deputy snarled, swinging his rifle back toward Nakota. "The Indian dies now, and anyone who tries to stop me can explain it to." He never finished the sentence. Sullivan's rifle spoke first, the bullet taking Crawford high in the chest and spinning him around like a child's toy. The deputy marshal went down hard, his own weapon discharging harmlessly into the night sky as he fell. For a moment, absolute silence reigned over the prairie. Then Crawford's men began reaching for their guns, and the night exploded into chaos. The gunfight lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but it felt like hours to Nakota as he shielded Penny's body with his own while bullets whined through the air above them. When the shooting finally stopped, 2 of Crawford's men were down and the other 2 had their hands raised in surrender. Pete Morrison was clutching a bloody arm, but he was still standing. Sullivan was untouched, his rifle smoking in the moonlight. "Jesus," one of the surviving deputies whispered, staring at Crawford's motionless form. "You killed a federal officer." "I killed a man who was about to commit murder," Sullivan corrected grimly. "There's a difference, though I doubt a territorial court will see it that way." Nakota helped Penny to her feet, binding her shoulder wound with the field dressing Pete had retrieved. She was pale from blood loss but conscious and alert, her storm gray eyes taking in the carnage around them with shocking composure. "What happens now?" she asked. It was Sullivan who answered. "Now you folks disappear," he said simply. "Ride hard for that Crow reservation you were talking about, and don't look back. We'll tell Marshal Fairmont that Crawford went crazy, started shooting at everyone in sight. In all the confusion, you managed to get away." "He'll never believe that story," Nakota protested. "Maybe not," Sullivan agreed. "But it'll give him something to think about besides immediate pursuit. And it'll give you time to get across the reservation boundary where he can't follow without starting a war with the Crow Nation." One of the surviving deputies stepped forward. "You can't just let them go, Sullivan." "They're federal fugitives, are they?" Sullivan asked mildly. "All I see is a woman who doesn't want to marry a man twice. Her age and a warrior who saved her life. Last I checked, neither of those things was a federal crime." The deputy started to protest, but Sullivan cut him off with a gesture toward Crawford's body. Deputy Crawford there had a reputation for being a little too quick with his gun, especially when Indians were involved. Word gets around among trail crews about which lawmen can be trusted, and which ones are just looking for an excuse to kill somebody. Seems to me like his reputation finally caught up with him. Pete Morrison stepped forward, cradling his wounded arm. "Boss is right," he said firmly. "I seen Crawford draw first, saw him aim for an unarmed man. Sullivan here was just protecting innocent folks from a killer wearing a badge." The young cowboy's testimony was delivered with the ring of absolute conviction, and Nakota realized that whatever Pete had seen or thought he had seen, he would swear to it in any court in the territory. Sometimes the truth was less important than justice, and sometimes justice required good men to bend the rules. "There are horses in the remuda," Sullivan said to Nakota. "Take 2 of the best and ride hard. You've got maybe 6 hours before Marshal Fairmont arrives and sorts out this mess. After that, you're on your own." As they prepared to leave, Penny stepped close to Sullivan and spoke quietly. Why are you helping us after what you did?" The trail boss was silent for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful in the moonlight. "Because 30 years ago, I was a young cowboy in love with a banker's daughter in Kansas," he said finally. "Her father had other plans for her, just like yours does for you. I didn't have the courage to fight for her then, and I've regretted it every day since." He looked directly at Nakota. "Seems to me like some folks deserve a better chance than I had." 20 minutes later, Nakota and Penny were riding hard across the moonlit prairie, 2 of Sullivan's best horses carrying them toward the distant Crow reservation and whatever sanctuary it might offer. Behind them, the cattle camp had returned to quiet watchfulness, and ahead lay 40 miles of open country and the promise of freedom. But even as they rode through the night, Nakota knew that their troubles were far from over. Marshal Fairmont would not give up easily, and Crawford's death would only make him more determined to see justice done according to his own definition. The sanctuary of the reservation was temporary at best, and eventually they would have to face the consequences of the choices they had made. Still, as he felt Penny's arms around his waist and heard her voice speaking softly of love and hope, despite everything they had endured, Nakota found himself believing that perhaps some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. 3 months after the gunfight on the Montana prairie, Nakota and Penny stood together on a ridge overlooking the Crow Reservation, but they were no longer the desperate fugitives who had sought sanctuary in those rolling hills. The woman beside him wore traditional Crow wedding dress, her hair braided with eagle feathers and silver ornaments that caught the autumn sunlight like scattered stars. Her wounded shoulder had healed completely, leaving only a small scar that she wore like a badge of honor. The transformation had not come easily or without cost. Their arrival at the reservation had been met with suspicion and skepticism from a people who had learned to distrust both white settlers and other tribal refugees. It was only through the intervention of Robert Yellowtail, a Crow chief who had known Nakota's grandfather in the old days before the reservations, that they had been granted even temporary shelter. "You bring trouble to our people," Yellowtail had told them bluntly on that first day. "Federal marshals do not forget, and they do not forgive. Why should we risk their anger for strangers?" It was Penny who had provided the answer, speaking in the halting Crow phrases that Nakota had been teaching her during their desperate ride across the prairie. Her accent was terrible and her grammar worse, but her sincerity was unmistakable as she explained her situation and asked not for protection, but for the chance to earn a place among them. The months that followed had tested them both in ways they could never have imagined. Penny, raised in Boston drawing rooms and educated in Eastern schools, had to learn the skills necessary for survival in a world where every resource was precious and every day brought new challenges. She learned to tan hides, to gather medicinal plants, to help with the difficult work of maintaining a community, under constant pressure from federal authorities who wanted to reduce the reservation's size and influence. Nakota faced different but equally difficult challenges. Among the Crow, he was respected for his warrior skills and his knowledge of the old ways, but he was also viewed as an outsider whose presence brought unwanted attention from federal authorities. Marshal Fairmont had indeed arrived in pursuit, but reservation boundaries and tribal sovereignty had forced him to negotiate rather than simply take what he wanted. The breakthrough had come when Penny demonstrated her ability to read and write in both English and increasingly fluent Crow. The reservation's children needed education that would help them navigate both worlds, the traditional culture of their people and the harsh realities of dealing with white authority. Penny became their teacher, and in teaching them, she found her own place in the community. For Nakota, acceptance came through a different path. When a group of young warriors had decided to raid nearby settlements in retaliation for territorial encroachments, it was his counsel that prevented a war that would have destroyed the reservation. His arguments were based not on fear or submission, but on tactical wisdom and the understanding that some battles could only be won through patience and strategic thinking rather than direct confrontation. The wedding ceremony they were about to undertake was not just a union between two people, but a bridge between two worlds that had been kept apart by centuries of misunderstanding and conflict. Chief Yellowtail had agreed to perform the ceremony according to Crow tradition, while also ensuring that it would be legally recognized under territorial law. It was a complex arrangement that required delicate negotiations with federal authorities, but it represented something unprecedented, a formal acknowledgement that love could transcend the artificial boundaries that politics and prejudice had created. "Are you ready for this?" Penny asked, adjusting the ornate beadwork on her ceremonial dress. "Once we do this, there's no going back to the world I came from. Are you sure that's what you want?" Nakota replied, though he already knew her answer. They had discussed this moment countless times during the long months of preparation, exploring every doubt and fear until they were certain of their choice. "The world I came from never felt like home anyway," Penny said with a smile that transformed her face into something radiant. "This does, you do." Below them in the valley, the wedding guests were already gathering. The Crow community had turned out in large numbers, wearing their finest traditional clothing and bringing gifts that represented acceptance of Penny as one of their own. But there were also unexpected faces in the crowd: Jake Sullivan and several of his cowboys who had ridden hundreds of miles to attend the ceremony. Even young Pete Morrison was there, his arm now fully healed and his face beaming with the joy of someone witnessing a happy ending to a story that had nearly ended in tragedy. Most surprising of all was the presence of Marshal Thomas Fairmont himself. Penny's father had arrived at the reservation 3 days earlier, ostensibly on official business but actually seeking a final confrontation with the daughter who had defied him so completely. The meeting between father and daughter had been tense and painful, filled with accusations and recriminations that had been building for months. "You've thrown away everything I worked to give you," Marshal Fairmont had said, his voice heavy with disappointment and anger. "Your education, your social position, your future, all of it wasted on this romantic nonsense." "I found something better than what you offered me," Penny had replied with quiet dignity. "I've found a place where I'm valued for who I am, not who I can be married to for political advantage." The argument had continued for hours, covering old ground and opening new wounds. But gradually, as Marshal Fairmont observed his daughters' life among the Crow, something in his attitude had begun to shift. He saw how the reservation children looked up to her, how the women included her in their daily activities, how she had built a life based on genuine contribution rather than social obligation. The final change had come when he witnessed Penny and Nakota working together to resolve a dispute between two families over water rights. Her ability to mediate between different perspectives, combined with his knowledge of traditional law and custom, had created a solution that satisfied everyone involved. It was exactly the kind of diplomatic skill that Marshal Fairmont valued. In his own work, and seeing it applied in this context, forced him to reconsider his assumptions about his daughter's choices. "He's here," Nakota observed, nodding toward a figure standing somewhat apart from the main gathering. Marshal Fairmont wore civilian clothes rather than his official uniform, a small but significant gesture that suggested he was attending as a father rather than a federal officer. "I wasn't sure he would come," Penny admitted. "Even after everything we talked about, I thought his pride might prevent him from accepting this." "Pride is a luxury most people can't afford out here," Nakota replied. "Maybe he's finally learning that." The ceremony itself was unlike anything either of them had experienced before. Chief Yellowtail conducted the ritual in both Crow and English, weaving together traditions from both cultures to create something entirely new. They exchanged vows that spoke not just of personal love, but of commitment to building bridges between communities that had been separated by fear and misunderstanding. When Yellowtail declared them husband and wife according to both Crow custom and territorial law, the celebration that followed was unlike anything the reservation had seen in years. There was dancing and singing, storytelling and feasting, a joyous outpouring of community spirit that transcended cultural boundaries, but it was the quiet moment near the end of the evening that meant the most to both of them. Marshal Fairmont approached them as they sat together watching the dancing, his official demeanor replaced by something more vulnerable and uncertain. "I came here to bring you home," he said to Penny, his voice carefully controlled. "I was prepared to use every legal resource at my disposal to force you to return and fulfill the obligations I had arranged for you. And now?" Penny asked gently. Marshal Fairmont looked around at the celebration, at the faces of people who had welcomed his daughter and made her one of their own. "Now I see that you already are home," he said simply. "And perhaps that's more important than the political arrangements I thought were so crucial." He turned to Nakota, extending his hand in a gesture that represented more than simple politeness. "I don't understand the choices you've both made," he said honestly. "But I can see that they've made my daughter happy in a way that my plans never could have." The handshake they shared was brief but genuine, an acknowledgement that while they might never be friends, they could at least respect each other's commitment to Penny's welfare. as the night deepened and the celebration gradually wound down. Nakota and Penny found themselves alone together for the first time as husband and wife. They walked to the same ridge where they had stood that morning, looking out over the valley that had become their home. "Do you ever regret it?" Penny asked, leaning against his shoulder as they watched the stars emerge in the clear mountain air. "Giving up your solitary life, taking on all the complications that come with being married to a white woman in this place and time?" Nakota considered the question seriously. The life they had built together was not an easy one, and it would continue to present challenges that neither of them could fully anticipate. There would always be people on both sides who questioned their choices, who saw their union as a betrayal of racial and cultural boundaries that were supposed to remain fixed and inviolable. But as he felt Penny's warmth against his side and thought about the community they had helped to build, the children she taught, and the wisdom they had shared, he knew that some things were worth any amount of difficulty. "I regret many things in my life," he said finally. "But loving you, choosing this life with you, that will never be one of them." The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain and full of challenges, but no longer solitary. They had found something that neither had believed possible when they first met beside the rushing waters of Thunder Creek, a love that transcended the artificial boundaries of race and culture. A partnership that created something new and valuable in a world that desperately needed such bridges. And in the valley below, the Crow Reservation slept peacefully under the vast Montana sky, a small but significant proof that sometimes the most unlikely love stories could reshape the world in ways that politics and power never could.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.